The news media is clutching their pearls and crying about a constitutional crisis, that Donald Trump is starting to ignore the judges who keep ruling against him, no matter how strange their rulings are. But of course, this is all just political theater. This is in fact what the media has been hoping for. The strategy has been to get rogue judges to push ever more extreme and bizarre rulings against the Trump administration in the hopes of not just thwarting Donald Trump and or slowing him, but hoping that he would just get frustrated and start ignoring them, which then would allow them to push the narrative that Donald Trump is in fact Hitler reborn, a new menace, a return of the dictator, so to speak. And they believe that this will work in separating the American people from Donald Trump. But historically, this just doesn't seem to play out. For one, his base isn't going to care. In fact, many of them are calling for him to start ignoring these rogue judges. But what about the American people at large? Will this actually work? Let's pull up an article from Time. This is by Nick Popley, and it's titled "Deportations Put U.S. Beyond Constitutional Crisis. Expert," meaning an expert, says. Let's see what this expert has to say. The Trump administration appeared to openly defy multiple court's orders over the weekend, deepening concerns among Democrats and legal experts that the constitutional crisis many feared when President Donald Trump was elected has now arrived, meaning this is what they had hoped to happen. On Saturday, federal officials ignored an order from Judge James E. Boasberg of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, who had directed the government to turn around deportation flights carrying Venezuelan detainees. Instead, the planes continued on their course to El Salvador, where President Nayib Bukele, or whatever, a Trump ally, boasted that the 238 detainees would be held for at least a year in the country's terrorism confinement center, and he wrote "oopsie" too late on social media to mock the leftists here who are crying about this. And this post was later amplified by the White House. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio expressed gratitude to the Salvadorian president, pointedly ignoring the judge's ruling. Now, a day earlier in Boston, a similar scenario played out. "Oh no," he writes. A federal judge had issued a restraining order to block the deportation of Rasha Alawe, a Brown University medical professor with a valid visa returning from a family visit to Lebanon. Despite the order, she was deported anyway. Taken together, the incidents suggest that the Trump administration is increasingly willing to brush aside judicial authority in pursuit of its policy goals. You can almost hear the rubbing of the hands, like, finally, we can talk about this. It follows a pattern in which Trump and his allies have sought to test the limits of judicial power. Let me make a correction. It follows a pattern in which judges have sought to test Trump's patience with their strange rulings. How about that? Anyway, the article goes on to say the country is far beyond a constitutional crisis, according to Kim Well, a law professor at the University of Baltimore and a former assistant U.S. attorney. A constitutional crisis, Kim says, is the accumulation of unchecked power in one branch. We have seen now for weeks the Trump administration ignoring acts of Congress. What? Acts of Congress? I'm confused here. Maybe she meant the courts. Anyway, Kim went on to note that the president has ignored Congress's constitutional power of the purse by withholding federal funds and by terminating federal employees and senior officials without cause. Oh, come on. Anyway, other legal scholars, while alarmed, hesitate to label the administration's action as an outright crisis. Amanda Frost, a law professor at the University of Virginia, described the administration as challenging the courts thus far up to a point. I don't want to call it a constitutional crisis because I'm waiting to see them say in their own words, we will not comply with court orders anymore. They have yet to say that, and while they've done some things to violate the corners of the margins, they have so far followed along. Now, my friends, if there is a constitutional crisis, it is by design of these rogue judges who are attempting to interfere with executive authority and power. They are challenging the executive branch, trying to take their authority, Trump's authority, away from him. They are so hell-bent at denying the Trump administration a win, especially when it comes to deportations, that they are willing to go all out in their judicial warfare to prevent what they know is eventually on the horizon to stop Donald Trump. And on top of this, they know that eventually what's on the horizon is mass deportation, so this is also in the mix while they're trying to gum up the works. Now, case in point, let's talk about the situation with this corrupt Judge Boasberg and his order to stop Trump from using the Alien Enemies Act to deport a terrorist organization's members from the U.S. The Alien Enemies Act explicitly gives the president wide latitude, wide margin in foreign policy and security matters, areas where courts really don't have a lot of authority, and they tend to, traditionally anyway, tread lightly. But not Boasberg. He is trying to set up the optics. He wants to give life to the idea that Trump is a dictator. This is why the whole point of trying to stop Trump from having those planes deliver these prisoners and have them turn around and obey the judge. He hoped that Trump wouldn't do it. The idea was for Trump just to throw up his hands in frustration, say, screw you guys, we're just going to do it anyway, which is essentially what happened, although that's not the way that the Trump administration presented it, which foiled their plans. And the media themselves, the mainstream media, is desperately hoping and praying for this narrative to come alive. They are excited to dive into this. They believe that maybe this time they're going to be able to get Donald Trump. Maybe they can get this idea that he's a dictator to finally stick with the American people. But they have one big problem here. They're fighting a war over deportation, over immigration, which Trump is killing it in the public opinion. It is, in fact, his greatest strength right now. A recent NBC News survey from March 7th to the 11th showed that Trump has a net approval of 12% on border security and immigration, with a 55% approve to 43% disapprove. The country desperately wants this insane saga of illegal immigration to come to a close. And there is a solid majority of the American public that wants all the illegal aliens in this country, the 20 to 30 million people who broke into the U.S., to be kicked out. They want them gone. They're tired of paying for them. They're tired of them bringing in their crime. They're tired of them breaking our laws. People want this ridiculous saga to end. So knowing this, you would think that the Democrat Party and their political activist judges would be more careful in how they deal with Trump and his deportation plans. And yet, I believe that their TDS is blinding them to the dangers of walking this path. The courts are their only hope for the Democrat Party right now. And if they lose the courts, they are in serious trouble. What the Democrat Party believes here, what the corrupt judges are trying to accomplish here, is if they can get the administration to defy judges like Boasberg's rulings outright, just saying, you know what, we're not following any more of these judges' rulings, we're just going to do what we want, they believe it'll hand them the perfect soundbite, the perfect narrative that, see, Trump's a dictator, he's ignoring the courts. But I don't think that's going to work. This is an issue that is not hard for the American public at large to see and digest, much like the budget battle, where the Democrats caved like wet noodles. The American public can see that these courts are doing crazy things. There is a growing understanding with the American people at large that having a single district judge halting a president's national security efforts, especially efforts tied to deporting gang members of a terrorist organization, they're not going to like this. Not to mention this whole unconstitutional nature of a judge interfering with the president in his legal authority to protect the U.S. from foreign invaders. I'm going to show you this exchange between, I believe her name was Casey Hunt of CNN, and the senior White House aide Stephen Miller on the CNN network. Take a look at this.
So you called the judge's order just earlier today, quote, patently unlawful, end quote, and said that it was an assault on democracy itself. Does that mean that the administration is ignoring this order, and might you ignore future court orders that meet?
God, look at how she is trying to bait them. So desperate for that narrative. Unlawful administration ignoring all court orders. Oh boy.
The criteria you laid out?
The President of the United States and his administration reserve all rights under the Constitution to conduct national security operations in defense of the United States. The Alien Enemies Act, which was passed into law by the founding generation of this country, men like John Adams, was written explicitly to give the president the authority to repel an alien invasion of the United States. That is not something that a district court judge has any authority whatsoever to interfere with, to enjoin, to restrict, or to restrain any way. You can read the law yourself. There's not one clause in that law that makes it subject to judicial review, let alone district court review.
So, Stephen, when you say that this person has no authority at all, this is how our system works. It starts with these judges and then continues up. At what point does it become, in your view, legal for the justice system to be looking at this and making a judgment. And I fail to see how there's any other way but to start with where we're starting here before you get to eventually the Supreme Court.
Well, so first of all, there's a term in law, justiciable. This is not justiciable. In other words, this is not subject to judicial remedy. When the president is exercising his Article 2 powers to defend the country against an invasion or to repel a foreign terrorist that is unlawfully in the country, he's exercising his core Article 2 powers as commander-in-chief.
Is Venezuela invading the U.S.?
This is a very important point. This is a Title 50 authority. It's a commander-in-chief authority. So just to ask you a simple question, you talk about how the system works. Does a district court judge have the right to direct or enjoin troop movements overseas? Yes or no?
Well, Stephen, my question...
Okay, that should be enough for our purposes here. So Stephen Miller is 100% correct here. Judges have no power to stop the Trump administration actions under the Alien Enemies Act. None. They can't tell the administration how to deport people. They can't tell them how to operate under the Alien Enemies Act. None. Absolutely nothing. Okay? If the Democrat Party, if the courts wanted to stop Trump, the only legal avenue that these judges actually have would be to argue that the claim itself, the Aliens Enemy Act, was not validly invoked. That's it, full stop. Everything else is not legal for these judges to be doing. Not at all. And Judge Boasberg should know this. He is a federal judge. So either he's an idiot who didn't study this and doesn't know what he's talking about, or he is actively acting in a corrupt manner to thwart the Trump administration. And in my opinion, and I'm no legal scholar, I would believe that would be an illegal ruling, but there's not much you can do here. So just so we're clear here, the act, the Alien Enemies Act, gives the president authority to act once he proclaims an invasion or predatory incursion. And Trump's team, Miller, Bondi, are all arguing that this is national security power insulated from judicial meddling. And historically, courts have deferred heavily here. We can see back in 1948, Ludek versus Watkins, the Supreme Court upheld the deportation under the act, saying the president's decision was a political question that courts could not review, even after World War II ended. The act's text do not carve out any role for judges, unlike modern immigration laws. It is a wartime hammer. It is meant to crush threats to the U.S. You can't have these little judges nitpicking and stopping you from waging a war to defend yourself or from waging a defensive act to stop invaders. Period. Full stop. This is why the founding fathers created this act. It was designed precisely to stop corrupt judges like Boasberg from putting the country at risk by second-guessing the commander-in-chief's every move. But here's where things get convoluted, because you might be asking, well, what can we do about this judge? There's calls for impeachment. You've got Republicans like Representative Brandon Gill, he's a freshman, vowing to put up articles of impeachment against Boasberg over this power grab against the president. And that's all well and good. It's nice political theater. But here is the rub. It is next to impossible to impeach judges. Getting the House to put forth articles of impeachment could happen, sure. They have the majority in the House, right? However, to get a conviction in the Senate, you need 67 votes. And considering that the Democrat senators are deranged right now with a hatred for Trump, they want to stop him no matter the cost, this seems like it'll be an impossibility to get 67 votes the way it is now. And even if we lived in a different alternate timeline where the Democrat senators weren't rabid ideologues, there is history to look at. Since 1789, the Senate has convicted just 8 judges. That's it. So to give you context, of all federal judges that have ever served in this country, only 0.2% have ever been removed. Now, there are a few other tools in the war chest to deal with rogue judges, like convicting them of a crime and throwing them in jail, which effectively, it doesn't disbar them, but it keeps them from handling any cases. And there are some other things that could be done, but it's nothing worth getting into at the moment. The bottom line is, for now, there are very little options to deal with this judge. The way I see it is the Trump administration essentially has 2 choices. They either work it up their way up to the Supreme Court to get the Supreme Court to rule against the judge's crazy rulings, or they could just ignore the judge because the judicial system has no enforcement power over the executive branch. But that path is fraught with political landmines. I think they would still come out ahead, but it's risky. So whatever the Trump administration decides to do here, it's going to be fascinating, and naturally we'll be keeping an eye on the situation as it continues to develop.